a sort of Katrina 10 years later special, and his special got bumped so that they could have Donald Trump's live speech from Iowa air in its place. So it's going to play tomorrow night. What are your thoughts about how the media is still treating the people of New Orleans and the victims of Katrina? Don't you think that this is just sort of indicative of what's been going on all along?
Sure it is. It's an indictment against how we judge news and what's valuable, and it also speaks to how they look at black life, and the significance of it. I heard you say it earlier about the levees being built for Category 3 in New Orleans, which is a city on the Gulf Coast, rather, where the low-lying areas are predominantly black areas where black people resided. And so, obviously, the effort wasn't put into by the Army Corps of Engineers to make a levee that would protect those communities. And you saw the results 10 years ago. To put Donald Trump's speech in Iowa in front of what's taking place and not taking place in New Orleans over the last 10 years, I think is a travesty.
It's complete insanity.
This need for quote unquote ratings over the story. Donald Trump, with all his pomposity and arrogance and ridiculousness, draws viewers as opposed to telling a very, very important story. They chose to air Donald Trump, and I think that's just an embarrassment on CNN's part.
It's an embarrassment on CNN's part, and it's an indictment of the mainstream media in and of itself. And it provides all the evidence that the existence of Urban News Service and shows like Call to Reason and writers like yourself, it's all the reason why we have to continue to work together to cover and expose what's really going on.
So what has been done to improve the levees since Hurricane Katrina? Is the city prepared now for a Category 5? What's going on right now?
Supposedly, they put a lot of work into rebuilding the levees and to protect the city. I can't say with any certainty that that's actually happened. I think it's still a work in progress. But the fact that 10 years later, there's so much discord, there's so many disgruntled people, particularly in the black neighborhoods. You go to New Orleans, and if you go to the popular areas in the Dome, you will see a vibrant area that seemingly was totally unaffected by what took place 10 years ago, even though it had been affected. But you go to the Ninth Ward or to the East Side, and it's still very much in ruins. And in a lot of cases, as I wrote in the piece, the black residents whose homes were destroyed decided not to come back because they couldn't get insurance money. FEMA failed miserably. George Bush's presidency and his administration and how they slowly reacted failed miserably. And so it's it's quite disturbing. I can't imagine the fear that would engulf the city if another hurricane headed that way. I can't say with any confidence, and I'm not sure, even though the mayor seems to believe that everything is okay, I can't say for certain based on the people that I've talked to that those levees will withstand a similar hurricane to Katrina.
Wow. So let me ask.
10 years later.
Now, Curtis, a lot of cities, when they go through these kind of transitions, they are usually neighborhoods that are typically traditionally African American, or they're low income neighborhoods that come in and get gentrified. We see a city like Detroit being completely sanitized and whitewashed with, wholesale block purchases of property by developers who are going to gentrify in town Detroit. Why has there not been that movement toward the Ninth Ward in New Orleans? What's wrong with the Ninth Ward in New Orleans to where even the gentrification folks haven't gone back?
What was the last part? You said what's wrong?
Yeah, is there something wrong with the Ninth Ward? I'm surprised that it hasn't been gentrified given how long it's been abandoned.
Well, gentrification clearly is the buzzword of the today. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and areas near the Navy Yard and an area called 14th and U Streets, which were almost all black. And actually, prior to the riots in the 60s, were areas in which black people thrived. And then it became this downtrodden area after the 60s, but black people still live there totally. You go there now, and it's not the same. And it has been gentrified, and other races are walking their dogs and bike riding, and it seems like a whole new place with condos or apartments that have displaced residences into the Maryland suburbs.
Yeah, I lived on the corner of 16th and U myself back during when it was still about to come back up. So, you can't get Soul Brothers Pizza. You can't get Soul Brothers Pizza on the corner of 14th and U anymore. And you can't get a lot of stuff because that corridor has been gentrified unbelievably so. And so I'm wondering, Curtis, why have they not done that in New Orleans in the Ninth Ward? What's been holding folks back?
I think that's a legitimate question. One of the reasons, as I pointed out in the story, also was that overall there was $150 billion worth of damage, and they received $70 billion in aid. So that's not even half of what they actually needed to rebuild the city and make it better, or even put it back to where it was. So without half of the money needed, you and I can guess that part of the city that was not going to get the kind of aid needed to replenish and rebuild and welcome people back with something to come back to. So that's a major part of it. The fact that they just didn't have enough money to go around, and when they started dispensing money, the money made it to the areas in which they wanted it to make it, and not to the areas that they cared least about. And that's always in almost every city around the country, the areas where African Americans live.
Curtis, actually, I want to follow up on that because I'm very curious to know about who supported the rebuilding of the Superdome. What was FEMA relief money or any sort of public money at all used to rebuild the Superdome?
Yeah, FEMA, private donations, state money. They considered the dome obviously someplace where many, many horrific things happened, and 30,000 people stayed for more than a week under horrible conditions. They considered the dome sort of a touchstone, a point of that would signify the city back to being where it was. And so,
why didn't they ask the NFL to fund that and maybe rebuild people's homes instead? I'm going to tell you, that's the thing that really makes me angry. Is the NFL has a ton of money. It's a huge enterprise. How difficult would it have been for them to rebuild the Superdome and let that? I can't imagine that FEMA dollars go into a football stadium. That's crazy.
Right. I'm sure that the NFL contributed something to it, but you're right. The NFL is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is the king of all sports, and it's certainly, if New Orleans had stepped up and said, we can't use this money on a stadium. We have people displaced. We've got to take care of our people. The NFL, because New Orleans is an important franchise, because that building is where the Saints play, I think the NFL would have taken a much larger role. But it requires people in power, people of authority, to say that. And I don't think that happened. I think the people of authority decided that we needed to make sure by any means necessary we get that dome back up, we get games going back, to camouflage that everything is okay, that we're still here. I understand the power in that. When 9/11 happened, the Yankees had a game a few days later, and it was very emotional, and it meant a lot to the people in New York to say we withstood this terrorist attack, and we're still here. And the same thing with the Saints. But in this case, you have to take care of your people, and a lot of people failed, starting with Ray Nagin, the government, and going all the way up to the president.
Yeah, Ray Nagin was more focused on lining his pockets than he was repairing the city at the end of the day. And we have to be able to take a tough look at those kinds of things. And how are you feeling about the prospects, the long-term recovery prospects for New Orleans? How do you see New Orleans over the next 10 years?
You said, how do I feel about the process?
The
The progress?
prospects, what do you think the prognosis for New Orleans'
Uh,
continued recovery over, say, the next 10 years is going to be?
well, it's very interesting to me when you listen to, and I listened to the mayor of New Orleans when he came to Atlanta. I read his speeches when he was in Houston and in Washington, and I did a lot of reading about what he's been saying since in the last week when he's gone on this quote unquote tour to sort of push the idea that New Orleans is back and better than ever. And that alarms me, because how can you be the mayor of a city where you have a community that's still in ruins 10 years later, but yet you still say, we're back and come back home, and welcoming people back to an area which was the core of your city. New Orleans is a black city, predominantly black, and it's not anywhere near where it should be after decades. So with that idea, with that notion that he's sharing, it's hard to believe that you're going to see much more progress, because he seems to believe that it's already right. That's a scary disposition to me as the mayor of a city where it's clearly not all right.
Did the mayor offer up anything when he was telling their former citizens to come back home? Is there a jobs program? Where is he planning on accommodating new citizens, and what are the jobs that they have? What is waiting for people in New Orleans?
Well, the jobs aren't many. New Orleans was not a place that was thriving economically prior to Katrina. Certainly there had been a lot of jobs created because of Katrina in construction and in other industries. And I think it wouldn't be fair to not say that he and others have worked hard to rebuild the city, to try to drive the economy there and create jobs. But it's hard to say that he has presented a plan moving forward. What he's talked about is what has taken place over the years. He obviously came in after Ray Nagin was convicted and went to prison, and he took over in a tough position in New Orleans and has run with it. But he never outlined a plan moving forward. Obviously, I think in the story I mentioned that they have decided that 35% of the businesses that come into the city should be at least supported by African American businesses and contractors, and they failed miserably in reaching that number. So I don't know how you can do that if you put that made that a creed, so to speak, or in the contract, and why you can't hit that number, and they failed it by almost half. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and he, to use Donald Trump. Donald Trump is full of bluster and noise, but hasn't once laid out a plan about anything. He's talked about pretty much made personal attacks.
So
New Orleans hasn't made personal attacks. He's just talked about where they've come, and certainly looking at where they were 10 years ago this week, it looked horrible. It looked like an explosion had taken place that we probably have never seen before in America. And to be where they are is somewhat of a miracle, but it's not over. It's not completely better, because the neighborhoods where African Americans live primarily are not fully developed or redeveloped, and that's a problem that's going to exist for a long time, because they seem to feel like they've already made it back. And there's no talk about we still have to go to the Ninth Ward, we still have to go to the East Side and make things better for the people, to make them feel welcome enough to come back. There's no discussion of that I've heard.
So Curtis, you're essentially saying that Mitch Landrieu can't get in an airjet fighter and claim mission accomplished.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
My question is, given what those realities are, Curtis, are you suggesting that there is an opportunity, though, for ambitious, entrepreneurial African Americans to go in and create business in New Orleans? Would they receive support from the city and from the parish and from the business community overall? Like if I went there and started a factory and employed a lot of people in the Ninth Ward, what kind of reception do you think I'd get?
All I know is that they developed an organization that to do two things. One, to identify black-owned businesses, and that number doubled from 300 to 600. They also made it part of the deal that in this whole process of rebuilding New Orleans, that 35%, at least 35% of the people of new jobs that come into the city go to African American businesses. And that has not happened. It's only been about 12%, if I'm not mistaken, 12 to 16%. So I don't know how you could fail on something like that when you earmark the number and you don't hit the number if there are businesses there to do those jobs.
Who's holding them accountable? Who's holding them accountable for reaching their numbers? Because it sounds like there's no accountability there.
Well, I mean, when you have this kind of, these outrageous failings, from the levees not being built for Category 5 to FEMA horrible and slow response, to the Bush administration's slow response, to the red tape that it took these residents to get aid from FEMA. Those stories are just heartbreaking. The fact that they had trailers for residents on the east side and in the Ninth Ward, sitting in these big parking lots, but but the residents couldn't get them because they couldn't fill out these long forms, and nobody really knew exactly what the process was. So there's a whole lot of lack of accountability ability that's taken place in New Orleans over the last 10 years. Even from George Bush saying, "Good job, Brownie," to the former FEMA head when he came to visit, in the aftermath, and when a good job was far from what FEMA had done. So that, when you have these kind of breakdowns all the way from the top to the bottom, then lack of accountability just runs rampant.
Not only lack of accountability, but just a complete disconnect between the administration and their fellow Americans. It just seemed like there was no empathy. There was nothing. I remember Barbara Bush saying that the people who were living in the Superdome were living better there than they probably did in their own homes. That was extraordinary.
Yeah, she was at the Houston Astrodome.
Yeah.
And she said that, and it's just totally dismissive of people, and it shows how disconnected they are.
It's really revolting.
It's eye-opening to believe that sleeping on the floor and in a big arena, a big football stadium is better than living at home is a slap in the face. And nobody said anything about it at the time. What I think we should all hope is that with these special reports, that they ever get to air, and this story that I've done with Urban News Service and others that are who've written these stories about these 10 years, marking the 10 years of Katrina, that people wake up to it and start forcing people to be accountable, that bring to light that on the east side and in the Ninth Ward, the work hasn't been done. The mission has not been accomplished. People are still suffering. People are homeless. There's still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of abandoned homes. And people, if you know people from New Orleans, they're very, very proud of their heritage and their place, and they want to come back. Many of them want to come back. But they have to have somewhere to come back to, and they just don't feel that. And how can they feel it when you go back to your old neighborhood and more than half of the place is still a wrecking zone?
I have one.
Hopefully, I'm sorry, but just hopefully this attention this week will reignite the interest that was in the outrage that took place 10 years ago, and people will start trying to force people's hands, force the mayor's hands, force the politicians' hands, the people who represent those neighborhoods, to demand change, to demand aid to make it better.
So part of your article focused on one lady, Danya Richardson, who relocated in Atlanta after Hurricane Katrina demolished her home, and she's returned to her home at least twice now, and or maybe even for a third time, and every time she walks away crying
Yes.
at the lack of relief that the Ninth Ward has been able to reclaim since Hurricane Katrina. I was just personally interested in her story and just wanted to know, how she and her daughter are doing here in Atlanta. I know that they're homesick and would love to go back home, but just wondering if they're okay and how they're doing.
Well, Danya was, I think, 31 at the time when the hurricane came, and raising a child and in the Ninth Ward, and hard thing, and adhered to the warnings and left early. Came to Atlanta to live with relatives, and watch with devastation on the news reports, and seeing the water, the Gulf of Mexico, in some places 20 feet high, and seeing the horrific images that we all saw, bodies floating down the street, and people on rooftops and in the dome. And I think for any of us, we can't really imagine what it's like to lose everything. And she took with her what she could, and when she got back, hoping the house would be there, and the house was gone, pretty much, just a wreckage. And the whole neighborhood was the same. And if you got to see Spike Lee's When the Levees Broke, this documentary that won 2 Emmys in 2007, those images captured exactly what she saw. So obviously when she went back that first time, maybe a month after the storm, she was just crestfallen with the devastation. And she wasn't alone. Her story is repeated thousands of other times around the country from people who fled New Orleans in time and went back to see it. She went back, I think, 6 years later, and there was hardly any progress whatsoever. And it just hurt her because she grew up there. She was raising her child there. She was very connected to it. And it wasn't what she expected when she went back. And to go back this spring and to see that still, and particularly in this case, she went back, she said she disguised it as a trip to go gamble and hang out on Bourbon Street and go to a Falcons game. New Orleans Saints game. And she went back, and it was more, the devastation in her neighborhood was still there. And it just, it ate her up. And each time she left in tears. And so she also, what I didn't write in the story is that she said she's not sure when she's going to go back. She'll go back when somebody tells her that there's market change, and she won't have to leave, feeling really, really devastated by the lack of interest in a neighborhood of good people. And that's one of the other things she talked about.
Curtis?
The Ninth Ward, everything had its issues, but it was a collection of good people who lived there.
Absolutely.
Well, Curtis, we hate to end this interview because we could talk about this for the rest of the day.
Sure.
But we want to thank you for coming and being a part of our show. We look forward to working with you, covering many, many more important stories that we want to get out here on Call to Reason's Urban News Service report. And we can't wait to see you and talk to you again. Curtis, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, and thank you for your interest in the story and Urban News Service. We're trying to do a good job, and we appreciate the fact that you've taken notice.
Awesome. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from Curtis Bunn. He's an award-winning writer. He's with the Urban News Service as part of the new Call to Reason Urban News Service stories that we feature to give you a glimpse of what's happening out here in the real world with everyday ordinary Americans, Beth.
Yeah, the Curtis just did a magnificent job with this article.
Yep. So we'll see you guys on the other side of the break. You're on 87.9 FM, The Globe, on Call to Reason.